Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 3 of our discussion of Morgoth's Ring as we jump back into the annals of Aman. Tonight we're going to get to the sort of narrative bits when I think we can see the story really developing. Christopher comments on this, of course, how especially when we get to the Darkening of Valinor, right? And the story just kind of takes over, right? And of course, a lot of you will have recognized, if you know the published Silmarillion well, you'll know that pretty much that whole section is taken verbatim from the Annals of Aman, from that section of the Annals of Aman. So that was the bit which basically Christopher chose as like the final version of the story of the Darkening of Valinor, really. Anyway, yeah. Zach is teasing me that I'm dressed like a Vermonter today. So true, Zach. This is a shirt my wife recently got me, and it was a bit of a nostalgic purchase for her because I used to have a shirt just like this when we were in college dating. And Zach, we were in college in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. So, yeah, it was basically, you know, Vermont style. So anyway, yeah, exactly right. All right. So let's jump straight into it because we're going to see how far we can get here to not get to. I'm already going to be adding one day to the Annals of Aman. I'm sure I don't want to add 2 necessarily. So, okay. So let's go back to the beginning, right? Or at least to the beginning for one very prominent character, right? This was a really interesting little moment. And it came to pass that... Sorry, it came to pass that at last... Sorry, I'll come in again. And it came to pass that at last the Valar were content, and they were minded to rest a while from labor, and watch the growth and unfolding of the things that they had devised and begun. Therefore Manwë ordained a great feast, and summoned all the Valar and the queens of the Valar into Almarin, together with all their folk. And they came at his bidding, but Aule, it is said, and Tulkas were weary, for the craft of Aule and the strength of Tulkas had been at the service of all without ceasing in the days of their labor. Now Melkor knew of all that was done, for even then he had secret friends and spies among the Maiar, whom he had converted to his cause. And as of these the chief, as after became known, was Sauron, a great craftsman of the household of Aule. And afar off in the dark places Melkor was filled with hatred, being jealous of the work of his peers, whom he desired to make subject to himself. Therefore he gathered to himself spirits out of the voids of Ea that he had perverted to his service, and he deemed himself strong. And seeing now his time, he drew near again unto Arda, and looked down upon it, and the beauty of the earth in its spring filled him the more with hate. Okay. Awesome. So, okay. Yeah, and I understand that Rachel's saying, I don't know the Silmarillion that well, so I end up not knowing what's different. Yeah, I know that can be really challenging. And Rachel, I often kind of have the opposite problem in a sense that when, especially a part of the text like that, when it's really close to the published Silmarillion, which I do know very well, then I'll forget the other side. I'll be like, okay, I recognize that it's now almost word for word, right? Like the published Silmarillion, but now I'm forgetting how it differs from the version that came before, right? So it's tough to keep track. And I know I often make mistakes and slips with that kind of thing. Now, what do you notice here? We get here, for the first time, the origin story of Sauron, right? The sort of real origin story of Sauron, the final version. This is, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the first time that we've been told that Sauron was originally one of the Maiar of Aule. That this is new. Yeah, exactly. Christopher Bartlett says our Tevildo is all grown up. Yes, exactly. Where does this come from? Where does this come from? Why? We didn't have this. there was no reference like this to the early days of Sauron in any earlier version of the story? Why not? Sauron existed, right? I mean, he was there from pretty much the beginning in the Numenor story, and that started a while back. That started before The Lord of the Rings was made in the Lost Road days, right? Yeah, he certainly has gotten more important in the last 15 years or so, Brian. No question about that. But yeah, absolutely. This is inspired by The Lord of the Rings, right? Why is he connected with Aule? Because he's the ring maker, right? Because he's the craftsman that we see. So now when Tolkien is backfilling the story and the character of Sauron, Christopher was joking about the fact that, about Tevildo, right? I think we were all kind of amused when we discussed the Book of Lost Tales, how, the role played by Sauron in the later story is played by Tevildo, the Prince of Cats, in the Book of Lost Tales. So which is sort of jarring, right? It's not quite fair to say that Sauron was originally a giant cat, right? That's not quite fair because, of course, what actually happened, I think it's more accurate to say that the role in the story originally played by Tevildo, the evil giant cat, was allocated to Sauron later on, right? So it's more fun, but not quite as accurate, I think, to say that Tevildo became Sauron exactly, any more than you can quite say that Thu, the necromancer sorcerer, became Sauron. That's a little easier to maintain, right? Even Sauron from the Lord of the Rings hasn't totally forgotten Thu, right? So we have all of, these several evil characters, right? These several villains from stories that Tolkien has told, right? And they kind of come together into the character of Sauron as he emerges in the Lord of the Rings. But remember, all of that stuff about the the rings of power, right, and the forging of the rings and all that all emerged spontaneously during the writing of the Lord of the Rings. You'll remember from our discussion of the Return of the Shadow that when he started writing the sequel to The Hobbit, he didn't have any idea. Not only did he have no idea about the ring and the significance of the ring and the whole ring of power business when he wrote The Hobbit, he didn't even know when he started to write that it wasn't until the Ringwraiths showed up, right, that he began to figure that out and began to realize, hey, this would all work really well if that ring of Bilbo's turned out to be the ring of power and, Ringwraiths and everything else, right? And then it all kind of came together. When he comes back then to the Numenor story, so the character of Sauron had already been developed in the Numenor story, and then he kind of doubles down on Sauron, right, through the Numenor tradition, which also he, as we discussed, was passionately interested during the midst of the writing of the second half, especially of The Lord of the Rings. So Sauron now becomes firmly ensconced, right, as the number 2 bad guy, right? Morgoth is always going to be the number 1, right? Melko was the original bad guy. And of course, it's convenient for Sauron to be second string bad guy, right? Because it makes him less, titanic, right? He's big, powerful, important, but still lesser. He's not like Satan himself. He's like one of the chiefs of Satan's underlings, right? So that puts him on a different kind of track, right? On a different sort of level, along with everybody else, and makes the rest of the story sort of simpler in that way. But anyway, it's this then, having landed there, right, with the character of Sauron and having sort of, it seems very likely already, made some retroactive decisions about things like Sauron's role, that like the Tevildo Thu thing and everything, right? Now he's gonna work him through more consistently from the beginning. And so we have, voila, an origin story for Sauron, right? One of the Maiar of Aule so a craftsman from the beginning. It's interesting that, in a sense, that element of Sauron's character, you could say that that element is the very latest element of Sauron's character to be developed, right? He didn't become a craftsman until the very end, until the Lord of the Rings itself, right? Until the Ring of Power itself emerged as the primary plot interest, right, of the story. Before then, I can't remember any reference to any of the Sauron characters as primarily smiths, craftsmen in that way. But now he decides that's the essence, right? He's going to be one of Aule's people. Yeah, and that's also true, Brian. Brian says he's also a villain that Tolkien hadn't already devised a death for in the earlier Silmarillion stories. Exactly. Glaurung's already accounted for, right? No, you're correct. He had not disposed of him, right? He flees, and so is still a loose end when we get to the later days, right? Yeah, no, you're right, Tony, that he still has not forgotten all of the earlier story concepts, right? Many of those are still being worked in to Sauron, the sorcery business, right? Him as dark sorcerer, even necromancer, right? Of course, he retains that title, right? That name in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. You're right, James, that he is attributed knowledge, right? In Numenor, for instance, he helps the Numenorians with their technology and stuff. So it's not totally alien to him, right? I'm not saying that the craftsmanship thing comes out of the blue. I'm just saying that it was clearly not like, it was very far from the core of his character at the very least. Yeah, exactly, Brandon. Brandon says, Sauron, Third Age villain at large. Yeah, still at large in the Third Age. That was kind of certainly got to be a selling point, right? Yeah. And that is interesting. Tony's reminded of the idea about science and magic being the same thing from a certain point of view. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess the thing that I would say, Tony, in fairness, is that the idea of Sauron as like technocrat, Sauron as scientific modernizer, was already going out. I mean, I think that the high watermark for that concept of Sauron as technological developer, especially in Numenor, that was back in the Lost Road days. That was prior to the writing of the Lord of the Rings. When we returned to Sauron and Numenor, in the Notion Club paper materials that we were talking about in Sauron Defeated in the last book, there was very comparatively little sign of that. He had abandoned that along with the notion that the Numenorians were making, airplanes and modern battleships and had artillery and things like that, which was part of the initial conception. For those of you who weren't in those classes with us, this is what's behind. You may remember the references in the appendix, in the Akalabeth, to, in both the appendix of The Lord of the Rings and the Akalabeth in the Silmarillion, that when the Numenorians, when Ar-Pharazôn and the Numenorians show up in Middle-earth to challenge Sauron, he comes and surrenders because his armies run away, right? The original reason for, the root of that story was when the Numenorians arrived with their artillery batteries. Like, they came with cannon and gunfire, and the Middle-earth armies of Sauron were just like, they ran. There was no way they could even... It was not just like, they are so much more powerful than us, we'll never beat them. It was, these are sorcerers, magicians, they throw death from a distance and we can't possibly compete against them. And they ran off. So that concept, exactly, Christopher, the idea of the Navy with cannons and steam that went and attacked Valinor at the end. Yeah, absolutely. So that idea what received its fullest treatment back in like 1935, right? Back a ways in the Lost Road era. So he was already moving away from that. So I don't want to go too far in thinking about, in pursuing that idea of Sauron as like evil magician / scientist, right? As if Tolkien is really kind of combining those things. Obviously, the connection between wizardry and technology, as is so often with Tolkien, it's not going to get chucked out the window, right? He removes it from Sauron, but it's still lying around on the floor, so Saruman can pick it up later on, right? It's all good. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Exactly, Brian. I do think that the connection of the Numenor story to the Lord of the Rings story does really put paid to the idea about the extreme technological advancement of the Númenóreans. There are still some hints as if the Númenóreans did have, in some ways, simply better technology. It's not only that they, but again, it's more like the Enta Yaweorc, right? It's more like the the Anglo-Saxons seeing the ruins of an aqueduct, right, and marveling at what magical arts could have constructed such a thing, right? It feels a little bit more like that. What remains of that element of the Númenórean story and of the Sauron story it feels more like that than it feels like sci-fi, which it briefly did feel like sci-fi back in 1935. Okay. Yeah, I agree, Christopher, that if Elendil had like aircraft carriers and a fleet of fighter jets and things, it would make the Battle of Dagorlad a little bit more challenging to write in some ways. Agreed with that. Yeah, Tony, good. The construction of Orthanc. That's an excellent illustration of what I'm talking about. How those things that still remain, right? Or the reference to that phrase with the hands of giants, right? That they had put, the Sea Kings had come and placed this here with the hands of giants, right? And I think that's in the description of Orthanc, Tony. Yes, there's that sense of, we can't even understand how this was done. Was it sorcery? It might have been. We don't really know. Yeah. Now, Josiah, I agree with you. I don't want to overplay that. Josiah is pointing out that even post Lord of the Rings, the primary enduring characteristic of Sauron is deceiver, not craftsman. I agree. Again, I don't want to overstate my case here. My point is, when choosing an origin story, Tolkien chose Aule. He didn't have to do that, right? He could have chosen somebody else, which would have really highlighted the deceiver. I agree with you about the deceiver thing. That is a dominant characteristic of Sauron pre-Fall of Númenor, right? But that's not the direction that Tolkien went when he did the origin story. Instead, he goes craftsman, right? And that certainly does fit with what we see of Sauron in the Lord of the Ring. Is it Helm's Deep? That was my first impulse, but then I doubted myself, Josiah, that it was Helm's Deep, the whole "by the hands of giants" phrase that is coming into my head there. Anyway, okay. Yeah, Tony, you're right. He could have made him one of Melkor's from the very beginning, but he doesn't, right? Instead, he goes... And notice, he not only goes out of his way to make him one of the people of Aule, and thus to emphasize his origin as a craftsman, a great craftsman of the household of Aule, but he also makes him a traitor and a spy, right? Like, he makes Sauron he makes him despicable from the beginning, to be perfectly blunt, right? It's almost like the Balrogs you can almost respect, right? I mean, they're fighting for the wrong side, but, they seem to have chosen a side from the beginning and stuck with it, right? But whereas Sauron was, was a dirty traitor and spy. Yes, like Wormtongue, James. That's a really good point. You're also right, Jennifer, that so I think we can see both things happening here, Jennifer. We can see both the fact that he's giving Sauron a higher place to fall from, right? So he's one of the, one of the great craftsmen, right? A great craftsman of the household of Aule. So he's high ranking, right, in the household of Aule. But also it emphasizes that, like, from the beginning, he was this dirty little quisling, right? Spy and talebearer and traitor of his, lord and of his kin. Yeah. Also, like the poor orcs, John. Yeah, we'll get to that. We're gonna come up on the orc issue, right, in today's class, definitely. Yeah, Veronica asked, did Melkor even have an assigned realm like the heavens or the oceans or animals or plants? He never got a job. Not explicitly. But remember, the one thing that Melkor is associated with from the very beginning, from the Ainulindale onwards, is extremes of temperature, right? Now, that is associated with his, like, intemperance and the discord within the music. But I have always thought, and I think that the sea text of the Ainulindale seemed to me particularly to emphasize this possibility. If you notice, there's like the four major dudes, right? There's Manwë, who's the air, and there's Aule, who's the earth, and there's Ulmo, who's the water. What are we missing? What isn't there conspicuously not a Valar in charge of? Fire. Exactly. Like, it's conspicuous that there is no Vala who is in charge of fire. And remember what in the earlier version, in the beginning of the New Annals, right? When Manwë and the rest of the Valar show up, when they, filled with their love for Arda, descend upon Arda, what do they find? Melkor hanging out already, standing in a field of fire, being like, I did some redecorating, guys. I hope you like it, right? I was going for, like, the circles of hell look, right? What do you think, right? It's me, right? And again, this strong, I mean, he never says the words, right? Tolkien never says the words that, Melkor was associated with fire from the beginning. But again, like, I've always kind of suspected that, right? Even just from Silmarillion reading, once I started reading the Silmarillion, these earlier versions, especially that kind of glimpse, right? Which is not wholly unlike Disney's Hades, Jennifer. I can see what you mean there. Anyway, that seems to me very suggestive. And again, he's associated with heat and cold from the beginning as well. Now, Robbie, that's a really good point. Robbie says, wouldn't Aule be more suited to fire the way that Vulcan is? Aule is certainly very Vulcan-like, right? As far, being the craftsman and stuff. Aule isn't lame or anything. But yeah, there are obvious connections between Aule and Vulcan, who obviously was associated with fires, hence volcanoes, right? But Aule throughout, although he does have some of those obvious similarities to Vulcan, throughout the process, like whenever it describes Aule doing something, it's always earth stuff, like forming mountains and building mountain ranges and stuff. That's the kind of thing that Aule is always described as doing, right? And so therefore, although the Vulcan thing kind of works to me, the actions he's described seem always to be connected with earth and stone rather than with fire exactly. Yeah, Zach. You're right that the later story with the making of the sun, and this was even there in the earlier version to some extent, the story of Aryan, the Maya, right, who is associated with fire, and who loved Laurelin, and who did not follow Melkor. But even that, Zach, from the beginning, right, the significance of the fact that Aryan was not a follower of Melkor, it's like, why do you even need to clarify that, right? You didn't go out of your way to say Tilion, right, who, by the way, was not a follower of Melkor, right? Again, I think it's because Melkor fire, and so the fact that Aryan is a fire person who did not go along with Melkor was sort of a big deal. Anyway, yeah, no, Robbie, I agree. It's not that Aule is exclusively limited to mountains. You're right. He does, and we'll see some more of the forging stuff that Aule does. He is associated with forging as well, and he's even already he's becoming the father of the dwarves. And we'll come back to that later. But again, I'm just talking about thinking of the Ainulindale and of these earlier parts of the Silmarillion material, right, of the Legendarium material, when it talks about the things that the Valar do and their domains, that's what I'm saying. In those places, it seems mostly to associate Aule with mountains and stone. But anyway, okay. Sauron. Okay, I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. Notice the importance of the word, here I just like moving my whole slide around, perverted, right? That he had perverted to his service. This is important. The word perverted is going to be important later on when we get to the orcs, right? Because we can already begin to see not only Tolkien's interest in giving Sauron a clearer fall narrative from the beginning, as we discussed, but also being more insistent upon the theological premise that evil does not create. It only corrupts and perverts that which is in some way intrinsically good, right? That's what's going to get us into orc problems pretty soon. But again, the use of the word perverted there is already suggestive. I'm positive I didn't choose a passage for this, so I'll just throw this out there. We can see this also. It was one of those things that I kind of wanted to mention, but there was no passage I could quote because it's like all I wanted to point out was not what isn't there, right? And so that's kind of hard to do in a passage. But anyway, the Ungoliant stuff, right? Ungoliant. In the earlier versions, she is a primeval force of darkness, and she's Gloomweaver pretty much from the beginning, right? There's not any clear fall story for her in the earlier versions, right? We can see him working through this same, I think, theological issue with Ungoliant when he comes back around to her, right? He gave her more of a fall narrative as well, right? More of a corruption narrative. George asks if Aryan would have been a Balrog if she had followed Melkor. Well, I don't know that for sure, George, but that's sure what we went with in Film. So in Silmarillion Film Project in Season 1, when we told the story of the Valar from the Ainulindale through the Darkening of Valinor, no, that was Season 2, through the Chaining of Melkor is what I meant. We decided exactly that. We had a really fun scene reminiscent of what's his name, Abdiel from Paradise Lost, where Melkor has hit like the Balrogs who were originally spirits of fire, and she's one of them, right? And he's like recruiting the Balrogs who were originally these angelic winged creatures, right? And he's recruiting them to help him destroy the lamps in our version of the story, our more detailed version of the story for TV, theoretically TV, and we had Aryan refuse to go along with him, right? So she separated from the rest of the Balrogs at that point, and then the rest of the Balrogs fell and became creatures of shadow and flame, and of course their wings were destroyed so that they no longer have wings anymore, which was kind of an inside joke in some film project. But anyhow, yeah, so George, we don't have any proof for that, but that's totally what we went with when we did our adaptation, because I love that concept. Anyway, okay. Exactly, Tony. This has to line up with what Elrond says about nothing being evil in the beginning, even Sauron. Absolutely. That there are two major places where that theological premise is stated very explicitly in The Lord of the Rings. That's one, Tony. The other, of course, is by Frodo on the stairs of Cirith Ungol when he tells Sam about how the orcs have to eat and drink because the shadow can't make any real new things. He can only twist and corrupt what is already there. So that premise is firmly established now by The Lord of the Rings. And again, this is one place where we can see Tolkien is now kind of working that out. And I'm not saying that back in the old days, the Legendarium didn't have any theology, right? That's a ridiculous statement. And yet there were inconsistencies with its theology. And even more than there were internal inconsistencies, I would say rather than internal inconsistencies, what there were a lot of questions that the stories just didn't particularly care to answer. Like it just wasn't a big deal, right? There was very little theological exposition involved in the original stories. Now, he has worked that out. But again, sorry, I was saying not only was there not that kind of explicit theological consistency, there also was significantly less consistency between what theology there was and Catholic theology. And it is certainly one thing that happens over the course of The Lord of the Rings is that the theology of this world becomes more Catholic. It gets there. Yeah, Tony, you're right. Treebeard's statement about trolls also, or related to the formation of trolls, also states that same theological principle. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Exactly, Veronica. You are precisely anticipating the orc issue that Tolkien is lining himself up for within a few slides, if we can get there. So let's, in the interest of that, carry on. Thus there awoke in the world the two trees of Valinor, of all growing things the fairest and most renowned, whose fate is woven with the fate of Arda. The elder of the trees was named Telperion, and its blossoms were of shining white, and a dew of silver light was spilled from them. Laurelin the younger tree was called. Its green leaves were edged with gold, and its flowers were like to clusters of yellow flame, and a rain of gold dripped from them to the ground. From those trees there came forth a great light, and all Valinor was filled with it. Then the bliss of the Valar was increased, for the light of the trees was holy and of great power, so that, if aught was good or lovely or of worth, in that light its loveliness and its worth were fully revealed, and all that walked in that light were glad at heart. But the light that was spilled from the trees endured long, ere it was taken up into the airs, or sank into the earth for their enrichment. Therefore, of its abundance, Varda was wont to gather great store, and it was hoarded in mighty vats, nigh to the Green Mount. Thence the Maiar would draw it, and bring it to frith and field, even those far removed from Valmar, so that all regions of Valinor were nourished and waxed ever fairer. Okay, now, here's what I'm interested in this passage. In this passage, of course, it's easy to say there's no fundamental change from the earlier story here, right? He's taking the myth of the trees. So there are several mythic concepts from the earlier Legendarium that are being continued here, right? Without any significant change. The significance of the trees. Even the liquid light, which is literally dripping from Laurelin's flowers, right? And which, from the beginning, has been gathered in liquid form into vats, right? So that there are buckets of liquid light sitting around being used for irrigation, right? In Valinor. Yes, James Stevens says, Frith on a hill. Yeah, I can... Frith in a field, is exactly what I was thinking. Sorry, Watership Down joke, for those of you who don't know Watership Down. Frith on a field is all I can think of. Somebody says that's actually a line from the book. Frith in the field. Frith in a field. I think it's Bigwig. But anyway. Okay. On the one hand, as I say, elements of the myth, this is not a new mythology, right? It's not fundamentally altered. But do you see the difference? Can you feel the difference? I think there's a very distinct difference. And the way I'd characterize it, and keep in mind, please, when I say things like I'm about to say, I'm not pretending like I can read Tolkien's mind. I'm not even making an earnest theory to say, I am theorizing that these words crossed Tolkien's mind. Like, I'm not saying that, but I am trying to articulate what appears to me the impulse. What is the story of the story, right? What is the direction that the story is being moved? And to try to characterize that, I would say it's like Tolkien is asking how questions and what questions. So he takes the same mythic concepts, right? The light of the trees, the liquid light of the trees. He's taking the blessing of Valinor. That was part of the mythic idea before, right? That Valinor is blessed. And things in Valinor are just like, and there's no comparison, right? There's Amon and there's Middle-earth, and Middle-earth is in darkness and they have the light over there, and there's things are different. Remember that there was a vague kind of gesture towards a sort of mechanism. Remember that there were references back in the old version to air, right? That there was something different about the air of Valinor compared to the air of Middle-earth. And the children of Iluvatar, the elves, need the air of Middle-earth, right? Like, they can't cut themselves off from the air of Middle-earth entirely. That's why they live in the Calakiria, right? And on the sort of near side, so that they can like still get some of the air of Middle-earth wafting in their direction, but then they can kind of, like take a deep breath of Middle-earth air, and then they can go and live their anaerobic existence. Not literally anaerobic, but you see what I mean? Like, they can immerse themselves. It's like that. Yeah, it's more like that. It's like they immerse themselves in the gorgeous warm bliss of Valinor, but they've got to go up for air every now and again, right? So in this way, elves are like, right whales or something. I don't know. But anyway, my metaphors are getting worse and worse as we go. But again, so there were references to that. Like, there was something about the air. And similarly, when the elves moved back to Middle-earth, right, when they went, then the air changed them, right? And then after the sun comes up, and that changes the air more, and so it makes things change more quickly, and so that's why the elves fade and diminish in Middle-earth, because it's all about the air, right? Okay, so yeah, they do need their version of the canned air from Spaceballs, Robbie. Or I'm imagining like one of the cunning Noldor developing like tanks of air. It's like, you can live in Valmar for months and for years at a time with your handy tank and mask. Anyway, just like take a pull on this eventually every once in a while. Yeah, and Tony is making jokes about Bilbo's line about it smells like elves. That's legit, Tony. I think what actually was in his mind. It's not for no reason that Bilbo says it smells. I don't think he's just saying that elves have particularly pungent, though apparently pleasant body odor, right? It's like the air of the Valley of Rivendell is qualitatively different, and Bilbo can tell, right? When he's descending into the Valley of the Elves, he's like, yeah, it smells like elves, right? This is elf air down here, right? Yeah, no, I'm 100% convinced that that line, the smells like elves line, is connected indirectly in Tolkien's mind with all this business about the air and the elves back in the other thing. And Stephen, when I mentioned about the tanks of air, I was totally imagining Augre and the canister that Ransom is given in Out of the Silent Planet. Smell on this, you would say to one of the Noldor. Anyway, okay. Yeah, no, exactly, Jennifer. The smell, it's exactly not like the smell of Edward Cullen from Twilight. That is precisely what I think the smell of elves is not. Yes, that's, you've got it. Anyway, okay, but back to this passage. Tolkien seems to be asking, and again, remember my disclaimers, Tolkien seems to be asking a kind of question. He's not changing his mythology, but he's asking questions of his mythology that he never asked or certainly never answered in the earlier versions, right? Okay, when we say that Valinor was blessed, right? That it was in some sense the blessed realm, how? What are the mechanics of the blessing of Valinor, right? How exactly, where does the blessing come from, and how does it get, like, worked into things, and how does that function, right? And he has his answer. The trees, the light, the liquid light from the trees, the vats, those are all elements that were all there in the early mythology. But now we get that second paragraph. But the light that was spilled from the trees endured long, ere it was taken up into the airs. That's why the air is different, right? It's like tree light vapor, not just the light of the trees in the sense like it's right around here, right? But no, like the light of the liquid light of the trees has evaporated and entered the air. So the air is now different. You're like inhaling bits of tree light, right? When you're just like you're inhaling water vapor. Okay. Or sank into the earth for their enrichment. Therefore, of its abundance, Varda was wont to gather great store, and it was hoarded in mighty vats nigh to the Green Mound, almost exactly like was said in the Book of Lost Tales. But now, thence the mire would draw it and bring it to Frith in Field, even those far removed from Valmar. So now we have the Valinorian liquid light insta blessing irrigation system, and I'm sort of teasing Tolkien for this, right? And I'm not trying to make fun of him, but you see what I mean, right? You see the emphasis here. And this it's like he's answering a question which he never even really asked before. But maybe that's not fair, right? If we think about it, that business that I was just alluding to about the difference of the air in Valinor and in Middle-earth was there from the beginning, right? So to some extent, it was to some extent, he was always like, it's almost like that question was there in the back of his mind, right? Like even back in the old days when he was just doing a sort of a more kind of free floating mythology, right? He still seemed not to be able to constrain himself entirely from asking a why and how questions, right? And so he kind of worked that in, but it was not very systematic. Now we begin to say, okay, this is systematic, right? This makes sense. Now we've got an explanation. Now we know the mechanism underlying the blessing of Valinor, right? And that, of course, serves within Tolkien's new mythological economy, not to undermine the mythology, but to boost the mythology, right? Now we can see, because we understand the mechanism, far from undermining the mythology, now we can see the trees are even more mythically powerful than they were before, right? Now we know, now we understand more perfectly the role that the trees had in the blessing. It's in the old days, you could have been forgiven for thinking that the primary function of the trees of Valinor was just that they were awful purty, right? I mean, they were nice and I mean, the light was gorgeous, you know, and it was like, man, right? But we didn't know now that we know the mechanism, it's like, okay, so you can see how the very root of the blessing of Valinor itself was in the trees, right? And that to some extent, the lingering blessing of Valinor, even after the darkening, is still like a memory of the trees themselves. And that's really cool. So again, so it's not that it's getting less mythological at all, or again, even that he's changing the fundamental mythology. And yet we can see his methodology changing significantly, right? We can see him, if not asking new questions, facing those questions squarely, right? Investing in those questions. Whereas those passages about the heirs were kind of tenuous before. They would get he'd kind of toss in a reference to the heir, like, you know, and of course, like, they needed the heir of Middle-earth and had to return to it every now and again. And it's like, really? How? Why? But that would just be like a stray sentence chucked in at the end of a paragraph about the elves living on, you know, in Kor, right? Anyway, and again, this seems to me very clearly to follow in the path of that, the new direction in which the narrative is growing, or rather not the new direction the story is taking, but the new shape of the story, right? The new kind of process in which that the story is using to get to the old destinations. Yeah, Tony is thinking about Treebeard's comment about how the air is changing, right? Yeah, lines like that really come to sound different, don't they, when you read some of this other stuff, right? Yes. Yeah, good. And George is thinking about, you know, he says, is that maybe how the last fruits of the trees could bloom even after they died? There was still light in the soil. In some ways, I mean, that was, you know, the direct intervention of several of the Valar. But nevertheless, you know, we can kind of see that it does sort of work in that way. And so, like, the sort of the final distillation, right, of this essence. We'll see if we can talk about that passage a little bit when we get to the, there's no way we're getting to the sun and moon tonight. I can already tell you that. If we can get to Ungoliant and the darkening, I'll be proud of myself tonight. Okay. I'm going to pause to indulge Christopher's pet interest here, which is defining what, and again, I'm not trying to diss it. I think it's interesting, sort of. I think it's a little bit interesting. I don't try to pretend that my own lack of interest in this question is anything but a fault in myself. But this is absolutely Christopher's number one interest here. A possible explanation of a sort may be hinted at in the words cited above from the Annals of Aman, paragraph 17. Melkor gathered spirits out of the voids of Ea. It may be that, although the Annals of Aman is not far distant in time from the last version D of the Ainulindale, my father's conception did not in fact now accord entirely with what he had written there. So he's talking about the distinction between what Ea is at the end of the latest version D of the Ainulindale, and what Ea is in the allusions that are made to it in the Annals. My father's okay. He was now thinking of Arda as being set within an indefinite vastness in which all creation is comprehended. So Arda is set within an indefinite vastness in which all creation is comprehended, rather than of a bounded Ea itself set amid the void. So is there Ea and void around it? Or is Arda part of a void, and that void itself is part of creation? Like, Ea is the whole business, including the void on the outside of it. Then, beyond the walls of night, the bounds of Arda stretch the voids of Ea. But this suggestion does not, of course, clear up all the problems, ambiguities, and apparent contradictions in the cosmology of the later period, which have been discussed earlier. Yes, indeed, he did discuss that earlier. As I said, this is what exactly he meant by Ea is, I do think, an important question. Not my favorite question, but you can see what but I did want to at least acknowledge Christopher's interest in this, not just out of respect for him, but also because it does connect to these questions that we've been asking as well, right? One way one way that I would sort of characterize the issue here would be to say, what do you do with space, right? The image of Arda globed within the void, right, makes it sound like a floating planet, or maybe galaxy or something, I don't know, right? But the more important thing to me, the main thing I want to do with Christopher's speculations here is kind of take 2 or 3 steps back from it and say, okay, big picture here, big picture. This is the question that he's asking, right? Tolkien, was not interested in these questions before. He used these, one of the reasons for the problems, ambiguities, and apparent contradictions that Christopher is talking about. Those things, the ambiguities, contradictions, seem to me to have their root in the fact that Tolkien wasn't really himself at all very interested in this question. The Embarkanta shows that he is interested in how the cosmos is set up. I'm not saying it's not like he ever thought of that. But this question of, okay, that which we call space, and of course you'll remember how important this was to C.S. Lewis with the business about the heavens in Out of the Silent Planet, which we just discussed. Space, the heavens, is that part of Arda or not? Is that outside? So when you go through the doors of night, are you in space? Or is space inside the walls of night? Like where? So it's less a question of what counts as Arda and more a question of what are the boundaries, or even what are the relationships between Ea and Arda and modern cosmology, right? Modern conceptions of the universe, the world, right? Of course, it's also true that there are plenty of problems, ambiguities, and apparent contradictions in how we, still to this day, use the words like those, like world or universe, right? So anyway, that's, I think one of the things that we can see, one of the chief ways in which this particular inquiry that interests Christopher so much is important, definitely important for us to consider in these larger questions that I've been asking. It shows that Tolkien, I think, is wrestling with these questions, right? He's trying to define things in which he had no interest really before in defining. Hence the flat world thing, right? It was fine. Okay. I love the preamble. I've said several times that I found, certainly in the Ainulindalë, I found the presence of the frame material and the moments in which Pengalod, the narrator, who is reciting what Rumil wrote, or transmitting the stories originally transmitted to him by through Rumil, how transformative those references were for my understanding of the Ainulindalë. So I am really interested in the preamble to the Annals here as well. Here begin the Annals of Aman. Rumil made them in the elder days, and they were held in memory by the exiles. Those parts which we learned and remembered were thus set down in Númenor before the shadow fell upon it. Who's we? Who's we? Those parts which we learned and remembered were thus set down in Númenor before the shadow fell upon it. In the Ainulindalë, what was the frame? What was the narration frame? How did it work? Rumil wrote it, right? Rumil was the source of the Ainulindalë material. Pengalod was transmitting it To whom? Yeah, Ælfwine. Ælfwine, who is a dude, right? A man, a human, who visited the elves in Elvenhome, right? Ælfwine is the... So Ælfwine was from the beginning of Ælfwine, even back before he was Ælfwine, right? Back when he was, what's his name? Ariel. Was a link not between the elves and like the Third Age, right? Because of course, back in those days in the Book of Lost Tales, there certainly was no such thing as the Third Age, right? What was Ælfwine the link to? Yes. Yes. Valinor, these stories, and our world, right? Ælfwine was the transmitter into contemporary human history of these stories. So the reason why garbled versions of the stories of the elves and of the Valar remain in circulation, have remained in circulation, right? Even though, again, these are very garbled versions, right? It's because Ælfwine brought them back. So yes, ultimately, Marie, it is to modern England that Ælfwine is the link, right? And the Ælfwine character is retained in the Ainulindale frame. It is the explicit, the first person narrator of the Ainulindale is Pengalod speaking to Ælfwine, who's going to take it back during Anglo-Saxon times, going to take the Book of Lost Tales, or whatever it's going to be called, right, back to England, or what will eventually be England, and the memory will be retained, right? But here, in the revised preamble to the Annals, we have a turn. It's no longer Rúmil Pengalod Ælfwine. Now we get Númenor thrust into the middle of that, right? The first couple steps sound familiar. Pengalod is not named here in this passage, right? Here begin the Annals of Aman. Rúmil made them in the elder days, and they were held in memory by the exiles. So that's where Pengalod comes in. Because Pengalod is an elf of Gondolin, so the fact that Pengalod can transmit the stories that were made by Rúmil originally tells us that he's one of the exiles and stuff. Yes, okay. But to whom is Pengalod? Assuming that Pengalod is still the person involved, which I assume that he is, right? Yeah. And Josiah, you're absolutely right that Ælfwine and Elendil are linked in the Lost, well, not in the Lost Road. Well, yes, in the Lost Road ultimately, but primarily in the Notion Club papers, right? That's when it really, that link really sort of flowers, right? Yes, so that the idea of a memory, not just of the elvish stories transmitted to Ælfwine, but of Númenor itself, of the fall of Númenor, a sort of a cultural memory of the fall of Númenor, as evidenced in things like King Horn and other poems and stories like that. These are all things that we talked about in the last class on the on Sauron Defeated. Yeah, so you're right, Josiah, that Ælfwine gets connected with Númenor there, right? Yes, exactly, Veronica. Both names, Elendil and Ælfwine, mean elf friend, which of course is one of the central plays of that whole sort of generational Númenorian time travel thing, right? Which began in the Lost Road and gets taken up in the Notion Club papers. Okay, so who are we? Who's the we? Who is writing this text according to this preamble. I don't think it can be men living in Numenor, because it says those parts which we learned and remembered were thus set down in Numenor before the shadow fell upon it, which I don't think is how a Numenorian, like living in Numenor, would describe it. It is, of course, possible that one of the post-Numenorian, like the Gondorians, that would fit. That would fit. It could be written by the Dunedain. Those parts which we learned and remembered were thus set down in Numenor before the shadow fell upon it. That's possible. Yeah, Christopher, I wonder. Is it possible? Is it remotely possible that... Is it remotely possible that Bilbo, as narrator, translator, scribal figure, is beginning to creep in? I'm not saying that he's necessarily picturing Bilbo here exactly, but doesn't this sound like, for instance, things that we see in the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Using the first person plural to refer to hobbits, and the things that we learned from the Númenóreans and that were handed down to us, things that were retained from Númenor of old, transmitted through to them by the Dunedain, of course. I'm not trying to make any firm claims about that, but I wonder. I certainly agree, Christopher, that we are meant to think that Bilbo's translations from the Elvish contain the Silmarillion material. Absolutely. That idea was there from the very first draft of that, as you'll remember, in the War of the... No. Was it the War of the Ring? Or was it the beginning of Sauron Defeated? I can't remember. But anyway, in the draft material of the Journey Home, right, in the first draft of Many Partings, Bilbo gives Sam his manuscripts. His translations from the Elvish were his gift to Sam, not the bag of gold, the last drop of the Smaug vintage in case he thinks about getting married. That was a revision. The very first impulse that Tolkien had when he had Bilbo giving out presents and his present to Sam was the translations from the Elvish. Now, Josiah, I'm certainly ready to agree that the we indicates a sort of a mannish perspective, though. That seems to be most plausible as well. Again, I wouldn't go hard after the idea that he's thinking about Bilbo and hobbits, that hobbits are the we, that Tolkien intended when he wrote this. I wouldn't make that claim. But the possibility seems to be being opened toward in that direction in ways that it was not in the Ainulindale, right? And remember, the Ainulindale version, the C&D versions of the Ainulindale were written prior to this, like a couple years prior to this, during the writing of the Lord of the Rings, like while the writing of the Lord of the Rings was still going on. So I think that we can. This seems to me to be a shift from that Ainulindale narration towards this, and the shift seems to be opening the door, at least, for Bilbo, eventually. Okay, a few notes about the changing cast of the Valar as we move forward. No lord had Nienna, Manwë's sister, nor Nessa, the Evermaid. I love that title, by the way, the Evermaid. Sorry. The wife of Tulkas was Leia the Young, and the wife of Lorien was Este the Pale. Christopher Tolkien then adds, the text then continues as before, so that the two who do not sit in the councils of the Valar are the highest among the Maiar, become Leia and Este. There is no trace of this development in any other text, but Leia appears again in the Annals of Aman as the text was typed. Okay. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I was just looking at a couple comments that you guys were just making still about the Wii stuff. See, James, I don't think it can be elves. Sorry, let's peek back for a second. Yeah, they were held in memory by the exiles, those parts which we learned and remembered. See, I think that's in distinction. The exiles held in memory the annals as they were made by Rumil in the Elder Days. But we, by contrast, learned and remembered parts of it, right? And those parts that we did learn and we do remember were set down in Numenor later on, and which is being spoken of in the, I think, significant past tense here, before the shadow. So way back in Numenor, before the shadow. So what I'm giving you here is derived from the bits that we remember, that we set down in Numenor in the old days, which in turn were bits from the exiles, which they held in memory, the original version from Rumil. So I see it as fairly distant from the elves in that way. Yeah. Yeah, Matt, you're right. Evermaid equals always a bridesmaid. Yeah, true. But again, interesting, as we mentioned last time, the idea of of a virgin goddess, right, which is a fairly common concept, is not in the sort of later mythology at all, right? But we see that there was that impulse there, and Nessa was it, as long as there was still somebody else around to marry Tulkas, right? Which in this case was Leia the Young, who has a brief life, but then gets collapsed together. So we end up having sort of too many minor princesses here, too many minor female figures. And Este, of course, is going to get a promotion and be named among the Valar. And so this idea of Leia and Este being only the highest among the Maiar is going to vanish. As well, of course, as the idea of the Evermaid, right? There is, yeah. Good. Yeah, Jennifer Ewing says wallflowers. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of action here, right? There's not like a whole lot of jobs that they have, these female figures, right, at the sort of lower end of the Valian hierarchy, right? And so it isn't much of a shock, I think, that he ends up kind of consolidating them a little bit, because, yeah, they don't. But interesting to me is that in that consolidation, he does eliminate one of the roles that he had insisted on, which is the Evermaid business, right? And it's just interesting to me that Este Uinen, we talked about her demotion already, right? Which I was suggesting might have something to do with the changing conception of Ulmo's relationship, rather, with the ocean. But now Este, being eventually, though still not yet, promoted, is a contrary motion there. So it wasn't just about the any kind of like across the board de-emphasizing of the women among the Valar. Okay. Yeah. Jennifer says, what I mean is there are too many women and not enough men to dance with at the ball. Yes, too many ladies, as Elizabeth Bennet would say. Yep, exactly. parallels between Olmo and Mr. Darcy. Discuss. Okay, moving on. But here's a bit which still doesn't go away. With these great powers came many other spirits of the same kind, begotten in the thought of Eru before the making of Ea, but having less might and authority. These are the Maiar, the people of the Valar. They are beautiful, but their number is not known, and few have names among elves or men. There are also those whom we call the Valarindi, who are the children of the Valar, begotten of their love after their entry into Ea. They are the elder children of the world, and though their beginning began with Ea, yet they are of the race of the Ainur, who were before the world. They have power and rank below that of the Valar only. So the Valarindi are we still have this middle category, right? You've got the Valar, you've got the Maiar, and you've got the Valarindi clearly between them, having power and rank only below that of the Valar, and still clearly above that of the Maiar, even though the Maiar were there, right? They are begotten in the thought of Eru before the making of Ea. So in the Timeless Halls, the Maiar were there for the making of the music, right? But the Valarindi have their origin within Ea. Their being began with Ea, though. What does that mean? And they're of the race of the Ainur, who were before the world. Okay. The reference to the children of the Valar back in the old days, Book of Lost Tales days, right, was pretty casual. I mean, like, it was almost like a given that the Valar had kids. I mean, they got married, they had kids, right? It's like what happens, when two of the Valar love each other very much, right? I mean, that's like how it works. Okay. He hasn't abandoned that yet, right? All of them had kids. Morgoth had a kid. Remember, who is Melko's kid? Anyone remember who Melko's kid was back in the old days? Gothmog. Exactly. Gothmog was the son of Melko back in the old days. Good times. But yeah, exactly, Brian. It's just like most polytheistic systems, right? It's no big deal. Of course, it happens, right? But you don't ask questions of those kinds of... I mean, like, think again about Greek mythology. Footnote. Some people might scold me for alluding to Greek mythology as often as I am here and say, oh, that's a classic blunder. Tolkien was more influenced by Norse mythology than he was by Greek mythology. Absolutely true. He was deeply influenced by Norse mythology. But I always feel that people who say we should resist thinking about Greek mythology are totally forgetting a huge chunk of Tolkien's life, right? We're talking about a man who could spontaneously compose orations in Greek, right? Who came to Oxford in the classics program, right? This is a guy who knew the Greco-Roman classics backwards and forwards in Greek and Latin, right? So to say like, oh yeah, Greek stuff is right out, it's all Norse all the time in Tolkien's mythology, are being very selective, and I think very inappropriately so. Anyway, okay. Back to the Greeks. When you're reading Greek mythology and they're getting married and they're having kids, you don't ask any questions about this kind of thing, right? I mean, look, if you even ask questions about the, like, as I remember asking questions when I was a kid, questions like, why didn't Cronus digest his kids? Like he ate them and swallowed them and then like barfs them back up again an unknown amount of time later? And wouldn't that have been uncomfortable? And like, I mean, I remember being deeply puzzled by this when I was a kid. But my point is that the myths themselves are totally untroubled by things like this, right? It's just not the kind of question they're interested in answering, right? You can ask that kind of question all you like of the Greek myths. They're not going to give you an answer, right? And even, of course, as we have abundant explanation, right? Or abundant, not explanation, abundant evidence, right? Of the genetic compatibility of Greek gods and humans, right? So that they function as like, in some sense, like humans, but they're not exactly like humans, though it doesn't exactly explain wherein the difference lies and everything else. That's just kind of the world that that mythology lives in, and it's fine. I would add Norse mythology also does not demonstrate much interest in answers like that, except I would say one has to have an even more profound lack of curiosity about cause and effect in order to go with the flow in Norse mythology than one does in Greek. In Greek mythology, you just have to kind of accept the fact that the gods are kind of like people, but not, right? In some not wholly well-defined way, right? In Norse mythology, you've got to deal with people giving birth to things out of their armpits and stuff like that, right? Which also the myth seems not the least bit interested to explain how or why that works, right? Exactly, Marie, or Loki's children, right? Best not knowing. Just don't ask, right? Absolutely. So anyway, my point is, when the children of the Valar I almost said when the children of the Valar came out. And then I'm like, wait, let me back that sentence up a little bit. When the children of the Valar were mentioned back in the Book of Lost Tales, it was part of that whole world. Like, we were clearly in that kind of mythology, right? In that kind of world, as far as like logical cause and effect is concerned, we still were operating on a kind of don't ask, don't tell basis, right? We're not anymore. I mean, look at this explanation, right? This is a description which is, in some ways, not in all, but in some ways, much more interested in that kind of question, right? Yeah, good. Caden points out the question of like, so explain again how Athena jumped out of Zeus's head. Yeah, no, exactly. The question of, okay, the Valar could have kids, like they gave birth to children. And so there's some of these folks there are in some real and literal sense begotten and conceived, born to term and birthed by the Valar. And here his answer to that question is yes. He's not yet decided, okay, I'm just going to nix this whole thing, right? But he's explaining now in some detail. So the Valarindi and the Maiar, now that distinction was totally not clear back in the older days, right? Now we have some distinctions, right? Some explanations. I still don't know about okay, like the Valar love each other and beget children, but it's actually begotten of their love after their entry into Ea. Their love of each other, presumably. That is, the mommy and the daddy loving each other very much. But it also seems to me to suggest their love of Ea itself, right? Like, I wouldn't be shocked after reading that sentence. I wouldn't be shocked to hear that, like, one of the Vala participated in some parthenogenesis, right? Like, the love of that, but for Ea itself bore fruit and took shape as one of the Valarindi. no spouse required, right? That wouldn't seem to me to be wholly alien to this kind of thing, though he doesn't go there, right? Nancy is floating the theory that that must be who Tom Bombadil is. Maybe. But anyway, okay. All right. So think back to the irrigation system, right? The direction of Tolkien's thought that I think we're seeing, one of the patterns that we're seeing here. The guy who is coming up with the atmospheric like the evaporation and irrigation of the light of the trees into Valinor as the mechanism of the Blessing of Amon, that guy, I think, is unlikely to be permanently content with the Valar just have kids somehow, right? And I think, because of course what it raises, honestly, is the question of, okay, so what is the relationship between the Valar and their bodies? I mean, if you're going to have kids, okay. Like if they were incarnate, they'd have kids. All right, sure, right? But they're not incarnate exactly. Like they can incarnate themselves, but that's not, is that what their kids are? So are their kids then flesh? Do they have a hroa? Right? Do they, I mean, are they, or do they not? And if, anyway, you see what, there are still unresolved issues here. You can see him moving in that direction, but there are still unresolved issues. And again, I cannot imagine the dude who came up with the Valinorian, luminescent irrigation system being content to leave this in this state forever, right? And I think in the end, he's not gonna leave it in this state. In the end, he's going to leave it. Now, Josiah, I agree. Yes, that's the other passage. Their being began with Ea does seem to imply that the love of the Valar for Arda, which remember has been emphasized from the very, very beginning. That's why the Valar descend into Arda, is because of their love, right? So yes, it does sort of suggest, that's the other thing. Thank you, Josiah, for pointing that out. That was the other thing that was suggesting to me that the conception of the Valarindi, that is the generation, the actual origin of the Valarindi, not the idea of them, is connected not with the love of the spouses for each other, primarily or exclusively, but with their love for Arda. Anyway, okay. And then Josiah, yeah, we're going to have Luthien as the perpetual wrench in that system. There will be several elements of the mythology. And this is something we're going to see on several occasions, right? Where Tolkien has these two impulses, right? And I think we've already seen them. I think even just in tonight's passages, we can see them fairly clearly. The impulse to retain the mythology, right? He doesn't want to change it. He doesn't want to undermine it. He wants to, he still has not given full expression to that mythology. He hasn't published that mythology. It's that mythology he wants to publish. He's not abandoning it. But he wants to make it work. He wants to make it consistent. He now has this new impulse to make it all fit in ways that it didn't have to fit before. And Josiah, yeah, there are going to be several times where those two things are just going to come into collision. And he's going to be confronted with a choice. He has to ditch one or the other, right? With the Valarindi, the mythology is going to go. That bit of the mythology is going to go. And we don't lose too much there, right? Take the Valarindi that we really needed, like Eonwe, promote them to be Major Maiar, and we're good, right? Eonwe, of course, was the son of Manwe, just like Gothmog was the son of Milko. Anyway, so similarly, I'm blanking on her name. Oh, that's horrible. The handmaiden of Varda. Somebody remind me. You guys will remember. Ilmari, thank you, Murray. I know you'd remember. She is another one specifically mentioned as the daughter of Varda in the older version. So again, we can keep those characters around, right? But the concept of the Valorindi, we're gonna just eliminate that, right? But Josiah, as you say, what about Luthien and her mom? It's an issue, right? And he's not willing to get rid of that. And of course, the orc problem is I would put in this similar category. Exactly, Brian. There are some elements he doesn't give up, even if it can't really be perfectly reconciled within the new sort of more self-consistent, more thoroughly articulated mythology that he's building. All right, let's keep going. Nienna. I said last time we'd get to Nienna a little bit more. For it is said that even in the music, Nienna took little part, but listened intently to all that she heard. Therefore she was rich in memory and far-sighted, perceiving how the themes should unfold in the tale of Arda. But she had little mirth, and all her love was mingled with pity, grieving for the harms of the world and for the things that failed of fulfillment. So great was her ruth, it is said, that she could not endure to the end of the music. Therefore she has not the hope of Manwë. He is more far-seeing, but pity is the heart of Nienna. We're almost there with Nienna. Nienna has already undergone an enormous transformation. Nienna was the queen of the underworld. She was sort of like Persephone in the original version, back in the Book of Lost Tales. She was the Dark Lady of Night before. She has already changed significantly, right? She's not yet taken her final step. Most of the elements are there. Rich in memory, far-sighted, perceiving more of how this theme should unfold than most of the rest of them do. Not being jovial, right? Being associated primarily with pity and grieving for the harms of the world. The primary element that we don't yet see associated with her is hope, right? Hope. It's there, right? It's alluded to. Distance from her. She has not the hope of Manwë. Yeah. It's almost like that last step. It's like we can see it really. Tolkien doesn't see it yet, clearly, right? But knowing the step that he's going to make, we can see it's right there, right? It's just right there in front of him. And once he takes that last concept, this already Nienna is already now growing into a remarkable mythological figure, right? Remarkable mythological figure. With her grief and her pity, right? So great was her ruth. And Rachel and Josiah both at almost exactly the same time were commenting on ruth, right? Ruth is just the Middle English word for pity. It's the same word essentially. So great was her ruth that she could not endure to the end of the music. She was overwhelmed by her pity. So yes, the word ruthless literally is the same word as pitiless. It tends to be used as a synonym for merciless, right? To be ruthless is to be merciless, which is very closely related, but not 100% identical to pitiless, right? Anyway, yeah. And it's ironic, I do think, that ruthless, the negative version of it, is the only word that we still use in modern English, right? Ruth is such a wonderful word. Yeah, Veronica, Nienna is like the Virgin Mary who grieves for the state of the world. I think we can feel some echoes there. Absolutely. But not hope yet. And when he combines those two, and that's why, Cecilia, exactly as you say, we will get not only pity, but wisdom, right? Pity plus hope equals wisdom, right? And that's what we already get some sense of her wisdom, right? Her understanding, her farsightedness, and her understanding of the music. But yes, Christopher, I would be gruntled. I would be more gruntled if we would use Ruth more. I sure would. I sure would. Though I can't promise that I would be more kempt or shoveled, frankly, either one. But anyway, enough of that. Back to Melkor. Now Orome dearly loved all the works of Yavanna, and he was ever ready to do her bidding. And for this reason, and because he desired at whiles to ride in forests greater and wider than the friths of Valinor, he would often come also to Middle-earth, and there go a-hunting under the stars. Then his white horse, Nahar, shone like silver in the shadows, and the sleeping earth trembled at the beat of his golden hooves. And Orome would blow his mighty horn, whereat the mountains shook, and things of evil fled away. But Melkor quailed in Utumno, and dared not venture forth. For it is said that even as his malice grew, and the strength of his hatred, so the heart of Melkor failed, and with all his knowledge, and his might, and his many servants, he became craven, giving battle only to those of little strength, tormenting the weak, and trusting ever to his slaves and creatures to do his evil work. Yet ever his dominion spread southward over Middle-earth, for even as Orome passed, the servants of Melkor would gather again, and the earth was full of shadows and deceit. Okay. Oh, yeah, sorry, good. Josiah pointed out before we left Nienna that on the flip side, he says, I do think it's significant that his first impulse is to attach hope to Manwë, the Vala characterized as far-seeing. Yeah, I agree. Good. Sorry, Jennifer and Karita, I had meant to come back to your point too. Both were commenting on, inevitably drawn back to Nienna, her grieving for the harms of the world and for the things that failed of fulfillment. That is a very striking element. I agree. Remember what we were talking about fate and free will, right, and providence? It's clear that the music is not, it might be as fate, but it is not simply fate, right? Because Nienna can see some things that should have been, and yet which are not. Those things which fail of their fulfillment, and which she grieves over, right? So that's sort of an interesting point. Now, Karita, I agree. Frith is a word that deserves a comeback. And if we combine this sentence, this use of the word frith, with the previous use of with the Frithn fields, which were watered by the dews of Laurelin and Telperion, we can begin to see, right, Frith and fields. The fields were like the cultivated fields, whereas the Frith, the forests greater and wider than the Friths of Valinor, right? So the Friths are like the wild, the uncultivated landscape, right? The uncultivated fields. Okay. Anyway, yeah, Karina is sort of linking that. She's thinking about Nienna grieving about things that should have been good, which is different than mourning over things that are bad. Yeah, I do agree with you that this does seem to be in that general direction of nothing being evil in the beginning, right? That all that is harmful, all that is evil, all that is tragic is ultimately, all of those things are tragic stories. And those are the things, that's why Nienna is moved not to rejection, right? Not to disdain, right? But to pity, right? Everything, even the wicked, are pitiable. And of course, you could say the pitiable the wicked are the most pitiable of all, right? It's all in Boethius. But anyway, yes, Nancy, exactly. The verb form of Ruth is rue, which we still use in a very limited and kind of weird sense, right? Yeah, like you will rue the day, which is a little bit odd. But anyway, yeah. Not exactly. It's drifting, as you can see there from its root in the concept of pity, right? Not totally separate from it, but drifting towards regret, right? Yeah, exactly. Just exactly the word that John Moss used, drifting towards regret. But anyway, okay, sorry. Melkor. So the heart of Melkor failed, and with all his knowledge and his might and his many servants, he became craven, giving battle only to those of little strength, tormenting the weak, and trusting ever to his slaves and creatures to do his evil work. This kind of thing fits with what we were told of Melko in the earlier versions of the mythology. But of course, as we've already pointed out back then, Melko was a little bit more Loki-esque, right? Like the prank he pulled on the rest of the Valar with the whole making the lampstands out of ice business that we talked about before. And there was always something of the sort of like wild and unrestrained trickster. Not that he... Again, it's not that that was a full description of his character, but there were always still elements of that in Melko, especially in the earlier stages of Melko's career back in the Book of Lost Tales. This is different. With all his knowledge and his might and his many servants, he became craven. Again, that emphasis on his fall, right? Checking in on the progress of the fall of Melkor here. Right? And we see how he's not only been morally corrupted in his moral corruption, he has been lessened, right? He's not only falling, he's decreasing himself. His own choices are decreasing him, right? And it's another example, it seems to me, of a way in which, if we think about it from the chronology, not of Middle-earth, not of Arda, but from the chronology of Tolkien's writing, right? The external chronology. It's not Sauron who follows in the footsteps of Morgoth on the path down into the void, but Melkor who follows in the footsteps of Sauron. Because this, becoming craven, giving battle only to those of little strength, tormenting the weak, and trusting ever to his slaves and creatures to do his evil work, sounds a lot like Sauron, right? Think about that conversation between Denethor and Gandalf and Pippin, right, in Minas Tirith, about leading from the back and all that kind of thing, right? And how that reviewing moment, which I think gets too little emphasis in my opinion, when Gandalf says to Denethor, "One has come whom I feared," and Pippin says, "Not the Dark Lord," right? Pippin imagining that's endgame, right? Oh man, like game over if Sauron himself has come to take the field, and Denethor laughs at him, right? Not yet. Pippin is assuming that Sauron is the big boss, right? That he's the worst of the foes who could possibly come. And Denethor's like, no, man, you got to understand. That's not how it works, right? Grow up. And yeah, it applies to Saruman also. Both Saruman and Sauron have already embodied this particular trend. I don't remember any reference to anything like this exactly in the earlier mythologies. Again, we can see him kind of developing this concept. All right. Now Varda took the light that issued from Telperion and was stored in Valinor, and she made stars newer and brighter. And many other of the ancient stars she gathered together and set as signs in the heavens of Arda. The greatest of these was Menel Makhar, the swordsman of the sky. This, it is said, was a sign of Turin Turambar, who should come into the world, and a foreshadowing of the last battle that shall be at the end of days. Holy crap, I had forgotten about this passage completely, right? It's still there. For crying out loud. In his heart of hearts, Tolkien is still in the 50s imagining Turin Turambar to be the one who's going to strike down Morgoth at the Dagor Dagoroth with his black sword, right? Unbelievable. That is still there. The only time that story is mentioned, like explicitly told in some sense, is in the Apocalypse at the end of in the Quentin Inwa back from 1930, right, ages ago, and he never retells the story of the Dagor Dagoroth. None of the rest of the Silmarillion stuff gets there explicitly, but there it is. It's still there. I take this as very clear evidence that he might not be including it, but that's still canon in Tolkien's head. Amazing. 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 You can't keep the Master of Doom down. Josiah, I agree. Caden is suggesting that even the reference to the last battle in the Day of Doom, you know, that's obviously generally applicable, but Caden, I agree. I mean, when you keep this in mind, right, and you're thinking like Turambar, Master of Doom, Day of Doom in the last battle, like, yeah, it's still the, you know, it still works, right? Still, perhaps, potentially visible, but, yeah, oh man, that paragraph knocked me out of my chair when I was prepping for class, because I utterly forgot that was still that was in the annals. This is why I have so loved reading through these books chapter by chapter with you guys. It is like forcing me to be more thorough in my reading of the history of Middle-earth than I've ever been before. There are so many connections that I've forgotten or didn't make. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yeah. Good. Okay, let's keep going. Just couldn't pass over that. Now, the orcs. Get to the orcs. It's probably the last thing we'll be able to do tonight. But of those hapless who were ensnared by Melkor, little is known of a certainty. That is, of the elves, of course, by Cuiviénen. For who of the living hath descended into the pits of Utumno, or hath explored the darkness of the councils of Melkor? Yet this is held true by the wise of Erisea, that all those of the Quendi that came into the hands of Melkor, ere Utumno was broken, were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty and wickedness were corrupted and enslaved. Thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the Orkor, in envy and mockery of the Eldar, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. For the Orkor had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Iluvatar, and naught that had life of its own, nor the semblance thereof, could ever Melkor make since his rebellion in the Ainulindale before the beginning. So say the wise. And deep in their dark hearts the Orkor loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. This, maybe, was the vilest deed of Melkor, and the most hateful to Eru. Now, again, those of you who know the Silmarillion well will recognize this passage, right? This is the bit that Christopher chose to include as the explanation of the origin of orcs, almost word for word, in the published Silmarillion. My subtitle, of course, for this slide is recalling the old version, right? I called this Slime Not Included because, of course, everybody knows that slime was originally one of the ingredients. In all of the pre-Lord of the Rings material, including the 1937 Quenta, orcs were indeed manufactured from scratch by Melkor. Slime being one of the primary ingredients of orcs. So that's a huge change, right? And one of the clearest places, again, when we think about this new assertion made explicit in those several passages that we alluded to before from the Lord of the Rings, right? Post Lord of the Rings, there's no going back. You can't go back to making orcs out of slime and stone and hatred, I think. Though, again, he left out the exact ingredient proportions so that we wouldn't be able to make orcs ourselves, right? Don't try this at home. Yeah. Yes, Christopher, this is already, the concept is seeded in the Lord of the Rings by Treebeard, right? Saying that trolls were to Ents as orcs were to elves. Yes, exactly. It's a passage that Tony was alluding to earlier on. Yeah, good. So, huge change. Now, earlier, I cited this as an example of one of those places, one of the biggest places, where the two things that Tolkien has shown himself committed to, the continuation, even the deepening of his mythology on the one hand, and his answering of the causal questions, right? And fleshing out, making a consistent story that fits with the Lord of the Rings, and is a fitting and consistent backdrop, historical backdrop to the Lord of the Rings. I said there are several places in where those two things just kind of come into conflict, and he has a really hard time with them, and I cited this as an example. Why? Do you see why? What's the problem here? I mean, this seems like a good solution. Okay, so he can't create anymore. So he can't whip up orcs from scratch anymore. He has to twist and corrupt elves instead. Okay, what's the problem? What's the problem? Are orcs still immortal? Good question. Don't know. Do orcs die of old age? Don't know. Easy enough to say they rarely get a chance. But, yeah, no clue. Exactly. Yes. Stephen and Sharon. Stephen is asking the question, can orcs be redeemed? Look at that not last sentence, that penultimate sentence. And deep in their dark hearts, the Orcor loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. They're miserable. They live in fear and misery, oppressed and enslaved by their master, whom they themselves hate. Shouldn't, therefore, the appropriate response to that be, let's free the orcs? Right? Let's liberate them? Right? What's he not willing to let go of? I agree with Sharon. What he's not willing to let go of is killing orcs with abandon. Right? That's throughout the Lord of the Rings. Think of the orc counting contest. Think of Aragorn's words to Sam when he's bandaging his forehead after they get out of Moria. Right? Talking about the slaying of his first orc. Right? For instance. I mean, there's the ruthless, to use the old word, the ruthless extermination of orcs in Middle-earth. This solves the creation ex nihilo problem, right? But it creates a problem that was not there before. As I said, right up until The Lord of the Rings was written, I honestly think that it's The Lord of the Rings that creates this problem. Because, again, the 1937 Quenta, orcs are still being generated from scratch. That is to say, if it sounds like orcs don't count, you know, as living creatures, that like when you're killing orcs, it's not even like killing a creature, like that killing an orc and killing a human It's like two fundamentally different acts, right? I mean, there's no moral connection between those two. There are many places in the Lord of the Rings which almost imply that, right? Which seem to suggest that. And that, of course, is a natural extension of the old story. If orcs are indeed just more like automata, right? Just animated mud, rock, and slime, animated by the hatred and violence and cruelty of Morgoth, right? He instills them with his anger, his hatred, and his cruelty, builds them up out of rock, mud, and slime, and sets them loose on the world, right? Yeah, like squashing the, it's not even like killing vermin, John. At least vermin are like, you know, like insects and rodents and things are still creatures of Yavanna, right? But these are not only not, the original orcs were not only not living creatures, they were like abominations, mockeries of living creatures, mockeries in a much more thoroughgoing sense, right? Exactly. They were more like golems. They were spawned. And so in that case, if that's what orcs are, really, that's why their blood is black too. They don't bleed, you know, red blood like it seems pretty much everybody else does, right? They're not. So in the Lord of the Rings, again, that was the origin of orcs. That's what orcs are. In 1937, when Tolkien begins writing the Lord of the Rings, and he seems never to have deviated from that in his writing about orcs throughout the Lord of the Rings story. And yet, while writing the Lord of the Rings story, at the same time, this other theological premise was growing, and he was beginning to state clearly, evil cannot create, it can only corrupt. That is to say, he was working, he decided to commit to a much more thoroughly Augustinian theology, for which that old idea, the idea of the orcs being created, orcs which could procreate, the orcs could, right? But that doesn't change the fact that they're still fundamentally not even truly biological creatures in the old versions. So I mean, there's a way in which killing orcs, I don't even know what to compare it to. It's not even like breaking rocks. You know, I mean, there was no parallel that I can think of to the slaying of orcs, like the non-moral consequence of slaying, and how slaughtering as many of them as you could is simply a virtue, right? I mean, it's like an accomplishment to have not the faintest moral qualm about in the old version. But now, deep in their dark hearts, the Orcor loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. Oh man, I got problems aplenty now, right? Now, how can we talk about orcs that way? How can we treat orcs that way anymore? Knowing that they are at least the distant descendants of people who have been culturally, generationally enslaved in fear and misery. It's tough. It's, I think, like slaying droids in Star Trek is, or sorry, in Star Wars is probably the closest thing I can think of. Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna raise that, but then I'm like, I don't know that I want to go in the whole like, you know, because then we're gonna start thinking about Data from Star Trek and that, you know, like that and the artificial intelligence question, and I didn't want to exactly go there, because in my mind, the slaying of orcs in Tolkien's old mythology is much more straightforward than the killing of robots. The question of like the humanity of robots or like the personhood of robots is to me a much more robust philosophical question than the question of the personhood of orcs in Tolkien's old conception. Yeah. Yeah, Alyssa is asking, what do I do with the line, I would not snare even an orc with a falsehood. Yes, I agree, Alyssa. That says more about the speaker than the status of an orc. Exactly. In fact, Alyssa, I take that saying as being 100% consistent with the complete a personality of orcs, right? That is to say, not even an orc, right? So like doing to orcs things that we would consider bad if they were done to anybody else, you know, like slaughtering them, right? But even granting that, I would not snare even an orc with a falsehood, right? Because again, that would mean like that would say something about me. That would say something about my methods that I'm willing to. So yeah, I'm not even gonna like. Will I slaughter them and decapitate them and celebrate that and like put up their heads as trophies and brag about how many I've killed? Yeah, sure, because that doesn't compromise my moral standards. Whereas lying to deceive and ensnare someone else, even an orc, would. Exactly. Yeah. Chris, I would say Eomer's dismounting to fight Ugluk on foot, which does sound like showing honor towards a foe. I would say the same thing, honestly, that it says more about Eomer's pride in himself than it does his respect for Ugluk. I don't think he does it for Ugluk's sake. I think he does it because he's wanting to be an example to his men and say, like, I'm not going to take an unfair advantage even over an orc because this is how you do it right, basically. Anyway. Yeah. Okay. So do they go to Mandos when they die? Absolutely. I mean, for a little bit, right? For like several minutes, this passage seems like a great solution to the problem. Okay, evil cannot create, it can only corrupt, so no problem. Corrupted elves. He takes the elves and he twists them and corrupts them and dominates their wills and renders them evil. Hey presto, orcs. But then you get but there's no answer to questions like, do orcs have free will? Do orcs go to Mandos? What happens to I mean, presumably, no matter what slow arts of cruelty and wickedness Morgoth employed, he does not have the power to change the gifts of Iluvatar, right? That's why I have to assume orcs are immortal. How could we argue otherwise? I mean, like, you'd have to present some pretty darn strong evidence to explain why they're not. None of the Valar can take that away from elves, can they? How could Melkor possibly control what comes of the souls of these imprisoned and tortured elves after they die? Surely, if you were one of the elves in question, who was being subjected to the slow arts of cruelty and wickedness, and thus corrupted and enslaved by Morgoth, if you were one of those elves captured by the shores of Cuiviénen and hauled off to Autumno and had that done to you, you could at least comfort yourself by saying, when my body and spirit are separated by suffering and death, my spirit shall at least go to will then be set free from the control of Morgoth and will go to Mandos and I can find peace again. Right? Right? Are you telling me that that wasn't so? That Morgoth could actually command and control even the very souls of these elves? I mean, it's like, again, this is a great solution until you think more about it, and then it ceases to be, right? And there is no getting around this dilemma, right? This solution, the corrupted elf solution, fits with the fundamental theology that he's now committed to, the cannot create theology. But again, Tolkien painted himself in a corner in The Lord of the Rings because he maintained the attitude of treating orcs like automata all the way through to the end, while the theology, and by the time he now comes and says, I've got to reconcile things with that theology, it's too late. It's too late. It's all there already. He'd have to rewrite not only the Silmarillion, but the Lord of the Rings to make that all work. Yeah, it's tough. That's why this is one of the big problems. One of the big problems. And Tolkien doesn't solve it. Tolkien doesn't solve it. Rachel, let me think for a second. About the... Rachel's asking about the Uruk-hai. Sorry, what I'm thinking here, let me think out loud more. I'm asking myself, I'm remembering, of course, the passage, and it's Treebeard's words, right? The Treebeard passage when he is the one who is speculating that the Uruk-hai are the result of the intermingling of the species, like the sexual intermingling of orcs and men, the races of orcs and men. And Treebeard calls this a black evil, right? Let us count the ways in which that is a black evil. But Rachel, so here's what I'm thinking. Where in this progress, like in the progress of Tolkien's theological decisions, right, did that passage come? The Treebeard, that passage is part of Book 3, Chapter 4, which is one of those passages which, as we saw in, I believe it was the Treason of Isengard, emerged almost totally. Like when he figured out who Treebeard was, and Merry and Pippin meet Treebeard at the beginning of that chapter. Christopher says that chapter almost word for word in its final state flowed in the very first draft. Like he just, like all of that stuff, everything that Treebeard says just came out right then. And that was pretty early. That was well before the Stairs of Cirith Ungol. I am pretty sure it was also before Elrond was given the line about for nothing was evil in the beginning, even Sauron was not so. I mean, that was back in the Council of Elrond, but I'm pretty sure he hadn't said that at the Council of Elrond yet by the time that Tolkien wrote that. So my thought then is that when he wrote that passage, the Treebeard chapter, and Treebeard is speculating about, so I'm trying to, if you see what I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to figure out what conception was likely in Tolkien's head at the time that he wrote that chapter. And I believe that the evidence suggests that the orcs as golems concept was still in his mind then. So therefore, the blending of the race of orcs and men, that orcs reproduce, is clear. Even in the golem stages, like that was part of what Morgoth did when he did his little act of creation / subcreation, slightly more than subcreation, of the orcs in Mockery of Elves. But orcs were a mockery of elves originally, kind of like the orc head on the statue of the king at the crossroads was a mockery, right? Like literally something set up in order to mock them. That's why he shaped the orcs as he did, to kind of look like elves, but twisted elves. cruel jokes of elves. Anyway, okay. Well, I mean, I get distracted. If that's what Tolkien was thinking when Treebeard said that, then the blending of the race of orcs and men would mean the joining of one of the children of one of the peoples of the children of Iluvatar to these hideous constructs, this construct race of Morgoths. And so that introduces really a whole new dimension in which that is a black evil for Saruman to have done, to have undertaken. And so, yes, exactly, Stephen, the Uruk-hai would therefore be kind of like cyborgs, almost in some ways. It does mean that they're genetically compatible, Jennifer, absolutely, though genetics, not exactly something that Tolkien showed great. I mean, we like to talk about in those terms now. Genetically compatible, that's not Tolkien's vocabulary, right? And so we should be a little careful thinking in genetic terms, because again, that's not his idiom there. But yeah, Matt is asking, do the Uruk-hai have to make a choice which race they belong to, men or orc? No, I think they don't get a choice, right? Yeah, Jennifer's remembering, of course, the Genesis 6 story of the Nephilim, the sons of God and daughters of men, which seemed to be a black evil and to precipitate the flood, in part. Is there an element of that there with the Uruk-hai? Yeah, sure. Oh, hang on a second, Jennifer. What happens? Well, we even get a flood, don't we? Anyway, sorry. Yeah. But Veronica, I agree. Half-orcs are a pretty disturbing concept. Absolutely. Absolutely. I say it's a black evil in many different ways. Yeah. Good. Okay. I think I'm going to end not because I've come to a brilliant rhetorical climax, but because we've run out of time, and I'm starting to twitch towards advancing to the next slide, which I should totally not do. So let's stop there, and let's stop there, and let's pick up with the Annals next time. Last week I said go ahead and read the next section of the Annals. I'm not going to say that this week. Don't read the next section, because it shall be my ambition to finish the Annals next week. So we'll try to get through section 6 of the Annals, this draft of the Annals, and then we'll move on to the next bit the week after that. All right. Can we talk about Shagrat and Gorbag next week, Chris? No. No, we can't. I don't want to talk about Shagrat and Gorbag. And the reason I don't want to talk about Shagrat and Gorbag is that in order to talk about Shagrat and Gorbag, we've got to go back and look at the text, right? We only through a close reading of the text of the conversation of Shagrat and Gorbag can we really have enough data to work with. And I don't want to go there. That's too much of a side note. We'll get there in exploring the Lord of the Rings. As long as we survive another 10-15 years, we'll get there. Yeah, exactly, Josiah. In a couple of decades, we're all over that. But yeah, no, like we'd have to look at the text. Anyway, yeah. So so no, I'm not talking about Shagrat and Gorbag. All right, Chris, just to please you, let me say one sentence about Shagrat and Gorbag. I think in Shagrat and Gorbag, we do see Tolkien beginning to struggle with the question. Remember, that's right after the Stairs of Cirith Ungol. Right after the Stairs of Cirith Ungol, where he has just reasserted forcefully in relation to orcs themselves, right? That evil cannot create, it can only corrupt. And then right away, as the first thing we get after Shelob is a conversation between two orcs in which we see some evidence that he is thinking of them as free agents in some sense, right? He is imagining for really one of the first times orcs as being more, perhaps. Certainly the clearest example that we get of that. And it comes after he's just made that declaration. So if I would characterize from a distance, without looking at the text, the conversation of Shagarat and Gorbag in any way, I would characterize it as one of the places where he's beginning to struggle with this, but he still doesn't work it out. And he certainly doesn't backwork it into the rest of the Lord of the Rings, right? So I don't see that passage as a solution to the problem, but as indicating that he's thinking about the problem, right? Okay, thank you. I'm done. Not talking about them anymore, but I totally agree. It's a really, really important and relevant point. It's just a little beyond the scope of what we have here. Okay, thanks everybody. Good night. I will see you guys next week as we finish the Annals of Aman, and of course more stuff coming up now. We've got session 2 of Film coming up tomorrow night, Griffith on Friday, and then back to exploring the Lord of the Rings on Tuesday. Lots of stuff going on. Thanks everybody, and I will see you guys sooner or later, somewhere or other. Good night now.
The Mythgard Academy has been offering in-depth discussions of awesome books and films since 2013, completely free to attend and free to download. If you've enjoyed our discussions and would like to help them continue, please consider donating at signumuniversity.org/fund.